Guest host Theresa Payton, former White House Chief Information Officer. This week, Cheryl Chumley and her first book, Police State U.S.A., How Orwell's Nightmare is Becoming Our Reality. In it, the Washington Times reporter argues the government's desire to monitor and control the public is greater now than ever before. Traffic light cameras, drone monitoring, and more amounts to a police state that must be rolled back. This program is about an hour.
Cheryl, it is a pleasure to be here with you today, and I really enjoyed reading your book, Police State USA. I'm a data junkie by nature, and I just love the opportunity to talk with people about how to protect their data. And we've got so many modern-day privacy issues that are coming up. And what I love about what you do with the book, it's so well-researched and so thoughtful and so provoking. And so I'm really excited to talk with you today and have a conversation about what do people need to know, and is there actually anything we can do about it? And I think you gave me a little bit of hope here in the book. You know, one of the things that I thought was really interesting with the NSA revelations, and I wrote a little bit about that in my book, Privacy in the Age of Big Data, was how consumers didn't realize businesses collect a lot of data about them and sort of their cooperation, whether you call it cooperation or coercion, I'm not sure, with the NSA. Was that what sort of compelled you to write the book, or were there other driving forces that you thought, I just got to write this book, I've got to inform people? Tell me a little bit about that.
Right. First off, thank you so much for meeting with me today. This is great. It's a pleasure to speak with you, and I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed the book. To answer your question, it was really other factors that drove me. I've been in reporting for a good 15 years, and of course, like most reporters, I started out on the local level. And covering the local level of government, you really get a hands-on experience on how policies and regulations impact just average Americans. And I remember years ago covering county government and watching people who had purchased properties with hopes of building their dream homes on them come into the local permitting and zoning offices and request, you know, the right to build their homes on their properties. And this certain county that I covered, it was almost like it was environmentalist ground zero battleground. It was so driven by environmental regulation and policy. They didn't want to build anything. And I recall vividly how this family came in with hopes to build on a $500,000 parcel of property they had purchased. And the local zoning people denied them repeatedly until the point they had no more appeals left. And I remember them leaving, the woman in particular, in tears, because now what is she going to do with that property? And, you know, that started, I was always keyed into issues like that. You know, I'm an American, and, you know, Constitution is a big deal. I read it, you know, just for fun sometimes. And so I was always kind of lasered in on issues like that. But covering the local government issues is what really drove me. That and having 4 children, and I worry about the fate of America and the future that we're leaving them.
And you bring up the children, and you're absolutely right. It's almost as if, you know, what the founding fathers fought so hard for, through clicks and choices, and some choices we don't even know we're making, we've given up those freedoms. And what I love that you've done in the book is you've actually quoted the founding fathers before each chapter, and when you read the quote, it really does relate to the chapter. So it shows that the principles of the founding fathers, the Constitution, what this country was founded on, even though the technology may change, the principles stay the same, right?
Right, and you know, it's kind of like the Bible. If you're a Christian or if you're a believer, you know, the Bible, the basic principles don't change. The Constitution, it's not a living, breathing document as Al Gore would intend it, as he famously stated, and as a lot of our politicians nowadays regard it. You know, there's certain core principles, and to me, the biggest founding father gift that was given us was the notion that our rights come from God, not government. And if you think about that, it's a very powerful principle, and one that I fear is slipping away, leading to the police state type USA that we have right now. And my biggest concern is recapturing that, because once you recapture it, then you set our nation back on the path that founding fathers intended.
So in the book, one of the things that was interesting is you talk about the places where you may not even know you're being tracked. And so, for example, mannequins. And my co-author and I actually talked about the same mannequins you mentioned in your book about, one of the things people might not realize, you drive up to the shopping mall, and if there's surveillance going on, your license plate may be photographed. Then you walk into the department store, your phone is talking to the Wi-Fi in the department store. Bingo, now the store knows you're there. And then the next piece is the mannequins are actually watching you and trying to decide female, male, gender. They may even try to decide ethnicity, all to store in a database, I guess, to serve us better. But then you added that there's some new technology come out, and this is what I'm sure people will say, are you kidding me? You added that they're going to be adding listening features to these mannequins. Talk to us about some of the risks and concerns, and what was sort of an aha moment for you when you saw this was going on at sort of the local department stores in Europe and America?
Right. Well, the aha moment really is when it crosses the line from, stores posting notices and cameras being displayed in prominent places so shoppers are aware that they're being recorded, to the point where you have no idea as a shopper that your movements and your conversations are being recorded, and for what reason you don't know. So some of the technology that they have in place now, as you just pointed out, the mannequins have moved from just cameras in the eye to also recording devices planted in the heads of the mannequin. And the cited reason for that is because the stores want to know shoppers' discussions, to hear what they say about some of the products that they display in their stores. And that way they can gauge what are the best sellers, what things need to be moved off the shelves to make room for something else. The big problem with this, of course, is most shoppers don't know. When you walk in a store, it's not like signs say, this dummy is recording you. You don't know that, and that's a little bit creepy, I think. That's something in a science fiction movie, it's interesting, but when it's happening to in real life, it's a little bit alarming.
It is, and it's one of those things. I don't remember walking into a store and having them hand me a disclosure statement saying, hey, by the way, you may not only be photographed for security reasons, but I kind of want to know what you're looking at. And second of all, I'm actually going to snoop in on your personal private conversations. So I think that was one thing that I think people need to be really aware of. And what's interesting too is I think sometimes companies in sort of this thirst for data, sort of this insatiable appetite they have for data, which helps them know their customer better, customer loyalty. It's supposed to be for good things maybe, right, to save us money or to stock things in the store I want. It's also to drive bottom line revenue. But, I think at what price, right? We know that all technology is hackable. We've seen the best and the brightest get hacked into. And, that data in the wrong hands could be potentially dangerous. And then I think as we learned, when it comes to if the private sector has the data, then law enforcement may want to request access to that data as well. I mean, could you see things, kind of progressing that way, whether it's recorded conversations or photographs while people are shopping?
Well, that is the big fear. First and foremost, in the private field, when you're a shopper, when you go in, you should at the very least be given a heads up to what information is being collected on you. Most people know about their zip codes and so forth, but cameras that are hidden, they also have new technology that pings on your iPhone. If you're a repeat shopper, if you're a big spender, it pings so it alerts the store clerks that, hey, this big spender's here, let's swarm on him or her and get him or her to buy more. It's things like that that shoppers may appreciate the convenience, but not knowing, you're not given the choice whether to participate in that or not. And the other side of the equation is you have to think when stores are collecting data, there's a database somewhere that's being kept. It's not just data floating around there. There's actually some sort of database where your information is sitting. And if law enforcement or government surveillance, intel and so forth, ever cite the justification to tap into that data, you have to be aware as an American, you don't have any control on that data being handed over.
Exactly. And so there's that. I like to think that we're still innocent until proven guilty, especially if we're minding our own business, right?
Right.
Let's stay on that topic of facial recognition, because you mention in the book, you talk a little bit about how law enforcement is using facial recognition, and how a lot of states, not just a few, but a lot of states at the DMV, there's a little added bonus going on while you're doing your license renewal. They're asking you, in some cases, not to smile. And the reason being is your photograph now has a dual purpose, right? It's not just about your driver's license anymore.
Well, all this data is being fed into, in some instances, into state data centers. And oftentimes, you know, maybe people know them better as fusion centers. But a lot of this data is being collected for counterterrorism reasons. But because counterterrorism intel at these data centers isn't generating what people expected them to, it's also being used for law enforcement and to fight crime. So when you're at your DMV and you're not smiling into the camera because they tell you not to, you need to be aware that this is yet another form of data collection, and you should be concerned, or at least curious, where is this going to end up?
Yeah, and so we also need to think about the choices we make. So the DMV, you don't have a choice. You need to get your license. You could go to your state governor and say you don't like your state DMV's practice, perhaps, and speak up. You don't have a choice. But you do have a choice on the types of pictures that are put out on the internet, on social media about you. And, you know, that's one of those important things that I think consumers need to realize, that you can take a little bit of your privacy back. Maybe DMV, you've got to go through your state process and make sure your voice is heard. But where you post photos of yourself, what you choose to post, going with those photos, what else is accompanying you in those photos, that can be just as important as well. And that's something that you oftentimes can control. Let's go into the banks, because we've talked a little bit about how there's some technologies now where, as consumers, we don't remember being given a disclosure saying, here's how I'm going to use your data, thank you very much. So we don't even know the listening or the photographing is going on. And what I liked about what you talked about with the banks is sort of that struggle they have in the modern age. And I remember when I first started in banking, I could not believe that we couldn't call on our own customers. I was on the technology side doing the platform for marketing. And they said, well, the first thing we have to do is we have to see which of our customers opted in for marketing. I said, from us or from somebody else? They said, from us. We're not allowed to market to our own customers unless they opt in, and we have to provide them disclosure statements. So the banks have always had this duty of care around, if I collect data about you, I have to disclose to you what I'm going to do with it, and I also have to protect it, and I know that, and I've got this duty of care. But what's interesting is I think a lot of people don't realize how much the banks are told to cough up your data, and it's not necessarily in those disclosure statements. So you now have, if you make a deposit over $10,000 because of anti-money laundering and potential suspicious transactions, the bank has to report you. No matter how innocent and how great a customer you are, they must report that transaction. They also have to report when you're signing up for credit. They have to ask a lot more questions than maybe they normally would ask, because they truly know you, because they have to actually prove to different bureaus within the government that they truly did their customer due diligence on you. Right. Talk a little bit about some of your findings where you were doing research on the banks, and some of the things the banks are being told they have to collect about you, and then literally turn around and hand it over to other departments and agencies.
Well, you rightly describe exactly what's going on with the banks, and they're kind of being put in a crunch. On one hand, you know, the federal government is bearing down on banks and saying, for counterterrorism reasons and so forth, you must collect information on your customers, you must know them. But on the other hand, the federal government isn't really giving them, banks, a checklist of questions to ask. And if banks don't ask the proper questions and something ends up being the customer is doing it is illegal, the banks could actually be fined for that. So the banks are kind of in a tight spot right now. But as a customer going into a bank, I remember back when I first started banking, banks used to draw you in by giving you, a free toaster, or sign up and you get, something free. And all that friendly neighborhood banking type of relationship is gone. Now when you go in, banks want to know more than just your name, social security number, date of birth, and so forth. They want to know sometimes where you work, where you do business, where your business that you work at does business. And if the business that you work at does business in an overseas location, they may pry into that. And the reason is they're trying to do their due diligence to keep the feds off their backs, basically. But what's happening is the average American is feeling like they're suspected of a crime when all they're trying to do is open a bank account.
And you're right. I mean, as you started going through the laundry list of what they may have to ask you now, you almost think, are you trying to marry me or just open up an account so I can deposit my money, right? I mean, this is kind of the third degree you're putting me through here. Iris scans on children. You're a mom, I'm a mom. You talk about this in the book. I talked about it in my book around how parents really need to understand when you put your children in the care of others, what may be going on in the name of security or in the name of grade tracking for your kids. And so as it relates to the schools, looking at things like we're going to record all of their grades online. Well, we just saw a young man who his friends, some of them paid him to change their grades, and while he was in there, he changed his own. And he's been busted for it. He got caught and got busted. But we can see sort of the dangers with that. And somebody might say, well, gosh, that's really just sort of high school hijinks, right? So, he shouldn't have done that. It was wrong. He'll pay the price. But no harm, no foul, because he was caught. Okay. But then there's the other piece about the data that's being collected about our children in the name of security. And one of the things you write about in the book was the iris scanning solutions being used at the schools now. In some regards, it's touted as this is a great way to make sure your child gets on the right bus and for us to notify you your kid got off the bus. And I'm reading that thinking, what happened to a teacher or a volunteer standing there saying, good morning, Susie, good morning, Johnny? I mean, why? Just because technology can do it doesn't mean you should. And you talk a little bit about the iris scanning that's going on. Talk about when you were researching this as a mom, but also as a reporter. What were some of the privacy concerns that hit you in the gut and that you felt like, gosh, people don't really know about this and they need to know? What were some of the things that really you thought, I have to cover this in the book?
The biggest issue for me was the not telling of the parents. The issue that you're referring to happened in Florida, and this was just in 2013, I believe. There was a bus that implemented an iris scanning program. Parents did not know about it, so when the child would board the bus, they were told to stare into the iris scanning machine until the light turns blue. And what was supposed to have happened was that data keys into information that the school had on the parents' residence and their home address, and it sends an alert that your child is on the bus, they're on their way home. Now, unfortunately, that school ended up being parents ended up being outraged at what that school did, because the person who was supposed to send a notification home to let them know that your child is going to be iris scanned, that person was sick that day. The letters were supposed to go out.
That human factor played in.
So all these kids were scanned on the bus, and these are little kids. It was it was like first, second, third graders.
And we tell them respect authority, right?
Right. So they don't know, and these parents found out about it, and they were outraged, and rightly so. And the school stopped doing that program. But what shocked me was the fact that this could go on, that any school would think, first off, that this is technology that's necessary, and second off, technology where parents, don't need to give some input and, be given the opportunity to say yay or nay to it before it's implemented. And also what shocked me was finding out that stuff like this is going on with fair regularity around America right now. These aren't as many, so much few and far in between cases as they are emerging technology, and it's becoming, a lot more abundant at our schools.
Do you feel like sometimes the hard part is the argument is this is in the name of security or convenience? That was also something else you mentioned is, they're saying, whether it's paying for school lunches or again, getting kids on the right bus versus the wrong bus, which I survived getting on and off buses, I don't know about you, without scanning my iris or turning over my DNA to anybody. And I see the danger of sort of people saying, well, it's about security, parents are busy. Let's say the notification went out in some of these other schools that are using it, and maybe people think, oh, wow, that's great. My school is implementing the latest and greatest technology to protect my children, and they're just not really thinking about, well, if all technology is hackable, and this company, who I don't know, it's not my school, it's been outsourced, has my child's eye scan. If somebody steals my child's eye scan, my kids can't get a new eye. They can't get a new iris scan. Now they can go masquerading as my child, whether it's for health care, whether it's trying to get into buildings once my children get older, whatever that iris scan gets tied to, somebody else may have the codes in the technology to literally fake out an iris scanner. And I think that's also part of the danger too, is people aren't thinking about there's the privacy aspect on the front end of we need to have full disclosure. But on the back end, if someone steals this data and it's your biometric, unique data about you, how are you going to recover?
Oh, it's worse than somebody stealing your credit card information. What are you going to do? And you touch on a really good point when you bring up, it's for the security. Another great argument is it's for the children. So, you can always make a worst case argument to justify, about any action on the part of the government. And with technology and iris scanning, biometrics, things like that, oftentimes it's that worst case scenario that's being cited as justification for everybody having to participate in this new technology. And as a parent, that's something you need to be aware that your local school could be looking at this technology as a way of securing your child.
I mean, you'd never think as a parent you'd have to say to your children, I want you to respect authority, unless, of course, they ask you to give up your biometric data, then please call me.
Right.
Or better yet, text me so I get your message, right? Speaking of, kind of that whole thing with disclosures and sort of eyes and kids, right? When we think about kids and we think about, talking to them about the different aspects of life, and you talk about like the birds and the bees talk, right? Well, now if somebody mentions the birds and the bees, they might actually be talking about drones. Right. You actually talk about the hummingbird model of drone. There's also the bee, that flies around like a busy bee model of drone. And the fact that, a lot of times when we hear the word drone, people think, oh, those are official military use or law enforcement protection use devices. And they don't realize, no, they're literally as small and as blending into nature as a bee or a bird at this rate. And some of the challenges with anybody can have a drone. You write about an elected official who literally looked out her window and came face to face with a drone. Talk a little bit about her experience with that, and maybe that was a good wake-up call for a lot of us.
Right, and it's funny because issues like drones and privacies, they cross political parties. It's Republicans and Democrats oftentimes that have the same concerns. And in this particular instance, it was Senator Dianne Feinstein. She was in her home, I think it was, and she looked out the window, and there was a drone outside her window. And she took that experience to Congress and warned her congressional colleagues to go slow on drone technology. As far as drone technology goes, though, I think that horse is basically out of the barn, and I think at this point there's not really a lot people can do to slow it as far as the private sector goes. The Congress has tasked the FCC to come up with policies for commercial use of drones by 2015. Amazon has already indicated that it wants to use drones to make product delivery. I think there was a pizza chain that was thinking of using drones to deliver pizzas. And I think what's going to happen is people are going to look at that, drones coming in delivering Amazon products is kind of a cool thing, and they're gonna, they're gonna use that, and they're going to be, it's kind of a cool idea. Science fiction comes alive, but then when law enforcement steps in and wants to use those same drones to conduct surveillance operations, I think that's where people are going to be a little bit more alarmed.
Well, and you talk a little bit about, too, that we've got cases where we've actually arrested citizens using drones. And, I mentioned some of the drone challenges in the book that I did. And what was interesting when I was doing the research, there's this cottage industry that's cropping up of anti-drone hoodies and anti-drone glasses. You mentioned in the book sometimes just as simple as smiling can help, full facial recognition and drone technology. But wearing a hoodie when a drone is targeted on you for some type of conflict isn't probably going to do it. And talk a little bit about some of the, the conflicts that we've had where and again, in the name of security, right? So there was a gentleman who basically kidnapped a boy off a bus, and they used drone technology to safely rescue that boy. Now, as a parent, my heart goes out to that parent, and I say, well, that sounds like the correct and reasonable use of technology. Then you talk about another case where cows started eating another farmer's seed grain, and that stuff is expensive, and cows eat a lot, and his family ended up in a standoff with the police. Drones got involved, and basically the police were able to get the cows and arrest the family. Talk a little bit about sort of these two very different scenarios. One, you're rescuing a life. One, you're just going and borrowing a drone to get involved in a situation. And what are some of the slippery slope dangerous points here for us from a privacy perspective?
Right, it is a slippery slope. That's a good way to phrase it. On one hand, using drones for, overseas conflicts, that brings with it a host of questions about, the moral ethics of waging war that way. But drones on American soil, that's something that, when you use them for criminal reasons, as you point out, a boy kidnapped off a bus and held underground in a bunker for several days, people can relax on that, and they can understand, good, let's get this guy. There was also drones used to root out a police shooter, Christopher Dorner, I believe was his name, and that was just in the last year. And, some police saw the feasibility, some American citizens saw the justification for that. But when you use drones for environmental reasons, as the EPA has indicated that it might want to do, to scour the fields to make sure that people's farmlands and crops and so forth aren't violating environmental laws, that might be where people would like to draw the line. When you use drones for surveillance type technology, where the police, they don't need to obtain a warrant, they just send drones up in the sky and collect data through a camera.
So wait a minute. So they have to have a warrant to search my house, but you're saying if they want to search over my house and over my yard, they can get a drone without a warrant?
Well, if police don't have the right now to use drones for surveillance technology for the most part. If they want to use a drone to conduct a surveillance operation, they can use one of Custom and Border Patrols. And, they can ask permission for Custom and Border Patrols to conduct their surveillance operation. But in the years to come, as drones become more commonplace and Americans become more accepting of drone use, if police departments are able to use drones, one of the slippery slope questions to ask is, when that drone is flying above properties, maybe looking for a certain suspect, but recording data all the same, it's sweeping up all types of data that is not pertinent, perhaps, to that suspect. So you could be standing nearby, you could be walking down the street, and your images are being captured on that, the video in the drone. And that's certainly something that most Americans may not think of when they give the thumbs up to using drones to fight criminals. But on the other hand, you have to think, where's my data going if it's captured on that drone? The law enforcement is going to have that data.
Well, and you bring up something really interesting, because didn't we just get on Google's case when Google Street View was taking pictures, and then they picked up all of our home Wi-Fi networks and device IDs connecting to it, and everybody said, wait a minute, like, that's not right. You shouldn't be doing that. I don't care what it is you're trying to do and what greater good you think that belongs to, but you've crossed the line. So we said that to a private sector company. I would think that we would say the same thing to law enforcement, or even I've seen where they've said that some counties have used drone technology combined with Google Street View to see if people have put pools in without asking for permits. So, you know, trying to tax people and fine people. And you say, well, so where, to your point, where do we draw that line? And that brings up an interesting point. You know, a lot of times when we look at whether it's a presidential election, when we're looking at our elected officials in Washington or elected officials at home, oftentimes we talk about either the national or local economy. We talk about national security. We may talk about some local issues if it's a local election. Do you think the third thing on the list might start to need to be around how are you going to protect a citizen's right to privacy in the digital age?
Well, I definitely think that that should be a question that candidates for office should be asked, and that they should be prepared to answer. You know, this is a moving target, and you know, since even my book came out, there's been a lot more instances that, had they occurred at the time of my research, I would have included them in this book. You know, the advance of data and emerging technology is something that it's really hard to put that genie back in the bottle once it's out there, so you need to plan ahead. You need to have in place policies and regulations guiding how some of this technology should be used, and it should always start with, you know, getting the public aware of how that technology is going to be used. Police departments shouldn't have drones in their closet that they can take out whenever they want, whenever there's a crime being committed. They should have actual policies and guidelines. What types of crimes are they allowed to use drones for? What policies do they have to pursue in order to launch the drones in the air? And what happens to that data after it's collected? And there should be some oversight on how police use that data after and what they do with it. If it's going to be destroyed, there should be a watchdog to make sure it is destroyed. So you're right, some of these candidates need to have in their minds, you know, how are they going to treat data going forward?
You know, it's interesting, too, you're mentioning laws. And if you think about it, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the mannequins at the mall, all of the things that you and I are talking about, most of those technologies are in the last 10 years. And the last time our country passed significant privacy or cybersecurity legislation is over 12 years ago. And so, you know, all of the things we just talked about they weren't really in the consumer eye and in the public eye really being used on a massive scale. And now they are. What do you think that are the implications for laws? You know, obviously it takes us a long time, and we should be careful when we create new laws. We should be very careful and deliberate when we do that. But you almost wonder, will the law be outdated by the time we pass it? And so, you know, how do we think about laws in this new digital age so that the laws can be dynamic and fluid and give us enough guidance so people don't step out of bounds, and we have the right balance on individual rights and privacy?
Right, that's going to be a hard challenge to solve, because when you talk about data collection, surveillance type technologies, right off it raises the red flag of privacies and civil rights, and those two things rarely, you know, head down the same path. The biggest concern, I guess, people should be aware of, and the one where, you know, citizens should put their focus in developing some real you know, regulations and principles to go by, is in law enforcement, because law enforcement have at their disposal, you know, technology where they can ride a vehicle down a street and peer into other vehicles and peer beneath people's clothing to see what they're carrying on them, and all that can be done without a warrant. Police have at their disposal technology that's emerging right now that helps them predict crimes before they occur, and not only predict them for the police to get a red flag or a heads up, but predict them so the police can actually respond to those areas of suspected crimes before a crime even occurs. And, you know, that's straight out of Big Brother, George Orwell type writings and so forth. So I think when people think of data, they need to think first and foremost, what is this data being used for? Can I be given a heads up without compromising the security of the nation? And if so, then people need to be in control of how that data is allowed to be used, specifically and most alarmingly with local police departments.
You definitely have hit on some really gray areas right now for law enforcement, and it's tough because they've got loved ones saying, I need you to work this case. You've got elected officials sometimes saying this can never happen again. When you look at something as horrible as the Boston Marathon bombing, and people saying, well, how did you miss the clues? And don't ever let anything like this happen again. So you see the next Boston Marathon, and you see the surveillance is completely different. And I think we'd all agree we don't like tragedies like that. But you mention in the book that sometimes it's those events, it's those tragic events where in that moment people want action, and sometimes they don't realize when they ask for quick action that they may be actually trading off a little bit of their privacy. You talk a little bit about what you sort of discovered when you were looking at your research, and it was interesting how you found the timing of when things have been allowed to occur, and people have said, oh, of course, that's okay, because the timing was, sort of following a tragedy.
Right. Specifically the Boston Marathon, I include that in my book because, history will tell and people can make up their own minds whether law enforcement was justified in practically locking down the city and some of the actions that they did to root out the two terrorists, in that egregious action. But what I wanted to make clear is that if enough fear is generated among people, then it opens the doors to what you just said, all types of civil rights infractions. And with the Boston Marathon bombing, what you saw was a city completely locked down. You saw law enforcement going into people's homes without warrants, pulling people out at gunpoint. Videos on YouTube were posted of this. There were, different stories told in the weeks and months to follow, how people's civil rights and privacies were completely trounced, and it was all in the name of security and rooting out these two terrorist suspects. You can make up your own mind whether or not it was justified, but you have to realize that if enough fear is generated, these types of things really can happen in America. And I remember specifically one story about an elderly woman who was in her home, and the phone rang, and she answered it, and she was told by the voice on the other end to answer the door. When she opened the door, she looked out, and there were scores of armed police officers holding weapons at her, both on her doorstep and across the street. What happened, and we didn't learn about this until weeks later, but somebody had called and said that the terror suspect was in her home. And so the police responded, they grabbed her, and they put her in detention, ultimately in a psychiatric unit for behavioral profiling, so forth. She finally got out, and there was no crime or anything like that, but it's just something that people need to be aware. When there's fear generated, oftentimes, your security is the first thing that you reach for, and your civil rights you could care less about.
Well, and in that particular case, too, there was there was crowdsourcing going on. So this is where big data could be helpful. So people are combing through information. They're looking at surveillance. They're looking at things that are being posted. They're also looking at misinformation. They forget there's a reason why you have a media. The media will be a trusted and vetted source. They may not move at the pace that independent people just posting things on the internet do. However, they typically do not release data until it's trusted and vetted. And during all of that, there was a young man who was wrongly accused. And, literally, it took him a long time to recover from being wrongly accused. And, he may have that haunt him. It's hard to get. I always feel like digital is forever unless it was something important on your hard drive, and then you can't personally get it back.
Right.
But somebody has it somewhere, right? But, in that particular case, big data, and used the wrong way, drawing the wrong conclusions, can be very dangerous. So you mentioned the privacy issues, and there's obviously that issue for that elderly woman, awful. and then a young man who's unjustly accused by the public through crowdsourcing is a pretty scary thought.
Right, and it's something that Americans need to be aware of. You know, these things can happen, and you know, when it happens to somebody else, it's easy to dismiss. When it happens in your neighborhood, it hits a little closer to home. When it happens to you, then all of a sudden you get it, and all of a sudden you're fighting for your privacies and civil rights.
Were you, I mean, you've done so much research on this book. I'm sure when you saw the headline about the right to be forgotten and basically sort of the focus first on Google, but I don't think it's going to end there. Were you surprised to see the EU really come down on, you know, sort of that right to be forgotten, and really they're going to be enforcing it? Were you surprised to see that happen, and do you think the U.S. will follow course, or do you think we'll just sort of wait and watch and see what happens?
No, I wasn't surprised at the EU's actions. I don't think America will follow suit. I don't think that we're going to have any policies put in place that clamp down on Intel or our you know, intelligence agencies to gather security information. I think there may be some lip service paid to, you know, politically correct, you know, to basically calm the American public, to say that we're not going to look at information on you without a warrant, or we're not going to do another NSA repeat where we're sifting through innocent Americans' information. But I don't think America is going to clamp down any.
Okay, so your prediction is don't hold your breath waiting for the right to be forgotten in the U.S.
Exactly, yes.
When it comes to looking at big data and the data collection that's going on, you do mention in the book, and you just mentioned it here, the fact that while you're looking for the bad guy, that a lot of innocent bystanders naturally get pulled in with that feed, whether it's pictures of a location, surveillance video of a location, whether it's drone footage, photos of every single person who gets a license at the DMV, all of that going into a database, you've done nothing wrong. What are some of your concerns after doing this research and just sort of maybe looking ahead with the fact that all of us minding our own business, that our information, whether it's our photo, whether it's our likes on Facebook, whether it's our searches on Google, or whether it's our picture at the DMV, all of that data having the opportunity to be aggregated and used, what are some of your privacy concerns as you look ahead to the future?
Well, the biggest thing is it turns average innocent Americans into immediate suspects by all levels of government. And that's something that, you know, our society is not based on that. We have the principle of innocent until proven guilty. And it's kind of a creepy feeling if you're not doing anything wrong. You know, at the same time, the government's regarding you as a possible suspect. But my real problem with this data collection is that on one hand, we're collecting all kinds of data across all levels of government, in business, in private sector, in government sectors. But at the same time, we're not really doing anything common sense to protect the security of America and to do those counterterrorism type initiatives that would be so simple to take. For instance, at the same time we're collecting data on innocent Americans, we're letting our borders remain porous. And if I were a terrorist right now, the ideal place for me to be would be coming up through our southern border, because it's porous right now, and I think that's something that our government could crack down on. So a lot of the common sense type security measures that the government could take are being overlooked, but at the same time, a lot of the ones that seem to put innocent Americans in the targets, those are being pounced upon.
You bring up a really great point. You know, if you had the opportunity to build out a privacy law, and there were 3 simple things in it, not a 1,200-page law, but you know, sort of maybe 3-4 simple things in that privacy law, what would your recommendation be that we look for in that law?
My recommendation would be, first and foremost, if it's a counterterrorism measure, it has to state clearly what the goal of that counterterrorism measure is, because way too many times data is being collected in the name of counterterrorism, and then it ends up being used for criminal aspects. And second off, I think that giving Americans the right to know should come first and foremost in data collection, if at all possible. If it's not something that's going to put the security of our nation at risk, then Americans need to be aware of it. And specifically in your stores with the dummies, that's something easy. Your iPhones, that's something easy. You know, some of these data collections are real easy to give privacy notification to Americans, but they're not being done. Iris scanning on your students, any type of data collection in schools, parents should not only be notified, but they should also be given the right to opt in or opt out, and they should be given a voice in the decision-making process. So those are just a couple of the things that I would say.
Those are great tenets. Yeah, I love that idea of if you're under 18, you're asking for my permission to administer aspirin when my child has a headache. I would think, that you would need my permission to take their iris vein scan, whatever other biometric you're asking for. And in my opinion, unless you're an official source that I trust with that data, I'm going to tell you no. Thank you very much. No, when it comes to the research that you were doing, what's one of the cases that you came across that you thought, this absolutely cannot be true, this cannot be happening, and so you just kept digging into it and then thought, this really is happening, this case is really happening? What was the craziest case that you uncovered when you were doing this research?
Well, there were a lot of stories that could fit into that, but the one that jumps in my mind right now, it just shows the utmost elitism of government when it comes to, you know, doing things in the name of security and not feeling the need to let people know. There was a city council decision out in Scottsdale, Arizona, and what it was, they wanted to build a new building for their law enforcement. And what they did was they didn't have a public hearing on it. They just voted to spend $1.3 million
it was around that number, yeah,
of taxpayer dollars to construct this building. But the thing was, they didn't want to tell citizens where the building was going to be built. And when I called and asked them, what's going on? Is this true? Because I saw other stories about it first. The justification was, this is a law enforcement building. We don't want to give a heads up to, you know, where our undercover officers may walk in and out of so people can come see them. But it was ridiculous because the square footage of the building, you know, it was a small town, dictated, common sense showed exactly where the building was going to be. And on the flip side of that, if you look up in Washington, D.C., it's not like they hide the Intel buildings. You know, people come and go all the time, and you can see who walks in and out of them. So I just thought that was an egregious example of how a local government board could spend taxpayer dollars on a building, you know, citing security reasons, and not even bother to tell the taxpayers where the building that they're paying for is going to be constructed.
And were there any repercussions for that? Or?
No.
So they're just basically okay doing that?
Yes, they dug down. When I questioned them, they dug down.
Well, you never know. Maybe in the next election you may see a few changes. I agree with you. I've been to Scottsdale and I thought, I'm not quite sure where they would put this building. Maybe underground. I'm not sure that it would be hidden. So that was really quite an interesting case. You know, one of the things you do talk about, though, is, you know, you mentioned we're on sort of this dangerous course, this collision course of slowly but surely, you know, we've justified for this reason or that reason, this is why it's okay to collect this data. But you say it's correctable. Have you seen any situations where, so for example, I know there was a department store here in the U.S. that when their customers found out they had the spooky, creepy mannequins that were looking at them, they probably would have really flipped out if they heard about the voice ones. They literally complained to the department store corporate headquarters, and they were doing a pilot, and they removed those mannequins. So there's an example where you could change the course if you let your voice be heard in, you know, sort of a civil, logical manner. So in reversing this course, you know, we talked about your wish list for a privacy law, and I think those were really good tenets. What are some other things that you've seen work well to sort of reverse this course and continue the wake-up call going, and for us to have the opportunity to grab our privacy back?
Right. There have been protests around the nation when local people learned that their police department were seeking drones to purchase and use on, for criminal reasons. And so those are successful. I would say if people want to put a stop to some of this data collection that goes on, or some of the militarization of police that goes on, you need to keep it at your local community level, because Capitol Hill politicians, they're not listening any longer. Your letters and your phone calls to them are just getting dismissed and pushed to the side. But at the local level, your local county governments and your local city councils, they control the purse strings on your police departments. So if you don't want your police department to have drones, then you should go to your local board meetings and petition your local politicians to not pay for this type of technology. You can use that very, very simply. Just go to the board meetings. They're held every couple weeks. And at the local level, your voice will be heard. And I have seen stories where just that was done, and police gave up the notions of buying drones or buying some of this more militarized equipment.
What advice would you have for corporations? We talked early on, and your book kind of opens up with this, around sort of the revelations of NSA, but then, not the whole data source wasn't, the NSA didn't put mannequins in stores, and they didn't create Microsoft, so they were basically partnering with the private sector, and we know that the private sector, they need to make money. That's why they, produce products. And at the same time, we want them to know us so they can service us better, but we want our privacy protected. Microsoft had, the slogan, and you talked about in your book of, your privacy is important to us, or protecting your privacy is of utmost importance to us. So what would your advice be to companies as far as their transparency to consumers and how they treat customer data, especially going back to the principle of, if you collect it, and we know that all technology is hackable, the bad guys want it. So we don't even need to talk about how might it be used by other companies or by government organizations. What about cyber criminals? So what would your advice be to companies, based on your research, on the next step they really need to take to regain customer confidence, customer trust, and to start rebuilding a transparency conversation around privacy? Right.
Well, slogans are good, but I think most Americans would prefer full disclosure and honesty. When you saw around Christmas time, Target shoppers, all their credit card and debit card information was being swept up and stolen and hacked. It was slow going to get the information on exactly how many had been hacked. And I believe the corporation was alerted to the hacking a couple weeks before they let it out into the regular public. So when you find things like that, you lose trust in the store. And it seems to me the stores that would give the most disclosure to what the data they collect is being used, those would be the stores that people would tend to flock to, because they feel comfortable. They feel as if that store or that corporation is actually putting their privacy needs first before the company dollar bottom line.
And that's a tough one, because especially if you're dealing with the companies online now. So there's one when you're in the store, but then there's the other when you're dealing with them online. And a lot of times you get that privacy policy. It's in that 6-point font on your little screen, and you can't go any further until you click OK. Same thing with social media services. And I find that more often than not, most people say, I know I should. They almost get guilty, like telling their dentist they didn't floss twice a day. And I know I should read the privacy policy, but I don't, is what a lot of people will say to me. And I'll say, well, I understand. A lot of times it's in legalese and it's small point font. But it really is so important. And your conversation around how companies need to be more transparent about this, do you think the privacy policy is a really great place to start? And let's kind of throw away making it sound like a legal contract, and instead be transparent, right?
Yeah, you know, simple language. I don't read half of those myself. They're just so long, it seems like, and you know, it seems like it's to protect the, you know, legal interests of the company. Really, though, if you're a shopper, the only way that you're going to dodge this data collection and, you know, just kind of skate around all this emerging technology is if you pay in cash. I mean, if you really are concerned about it, you can kind of, you know, keep to a minimum your data transactions and so forth. You can take your money out of the bank in cash, what you need, and then when you shop, pay in cash. You know, it's things like that. If you're really concerned about it, you can take a few steps on your own, with or without the companies.
You're right. There are some simple steps you can take. Are there some other ones that you felt are effective? You mentioned cash. You know, we talked about the whole thing about don't let your cell phone talk to Wi-Fi, otherwise the shop might know you're there. Are there some other things you uncovered in your research that you think are other simple steps that you could take?
Well, it just, you know, America has turned toward this whole social media phase where everything you do in life is thrown up on Facebook or Twitter. You know, that's all data that you're putting out there. Nobody's asking you for it. You're voluntarily putting it out there. So if you're concerned about data breaches and so forth, then stop, you know, stop doing half of this social media stuff. You know, there are a few steps that Americans can take, you know, where you don't have to just go live in the woods as a hermit. But, you know, you have to be aware, too, as part of modern society, you're not going to get around all the data collection that's going on.
You know, as you were doing the research and you were sort of drawing the different conclusions, the biggest takeaway you would want people to take away from your book, I know what mine, you know, there were a couple of things in here that really resonated with me. That were themes that carried over from when I had written my book on privacy. And it really struck me again, your tie back to the Founding Fathers, to the Constitution, to our personal rights. But what would be one or two things you would want somebody listening today or when they read your book, what would you want them to take away from this conversation?
I want people to be aware that when you read this book, these are all case studies drawn from recent media events. These aren't conspiracy-type made-up events where, you know, I'm alleging that we're on this police-state track and, you know, it's easy tinfoil hat argument. You know, these are things that you can flip on your evening news and look through your newspaper and see happening every day. Federal, state, local governments encroaching at all aspects of human activity. And the biggest takeaway I would like people to remember is that this nation was founded on the notion that our rights come from God, not government. And if you think of that, look around you and read my book and see how far we've strayed from that. And once that's gone, where else can you go in the world and live as free as we're supposed to be living?
That's a great takeaway. Great book. I enjoyed it. It was hard to put down. I read a few things a couple times through, lost a little sleep over a couple of things in here. You did a fabulous job. Highly recommend this for everybody, both consumers, business people, elected officials. Anyone in the U.S. definitely needs to read this book. Thank you so much. Job well done.
Thank you, Theresa. Thank you.